I would say, though, that I don't agree with Augustine's interpretation of Jacob's wrestling with the angel, because prior to Augustine, most of the church fathers interpreted the Theophanies as the person of Christ. And one thing that's important to note there is that the Theophanies are a bit of a mystery. So, for example, St. Irenaeus, if you read Bishop Irenaeus' work on St. Irenaeus, when he talks about the Theophanies, he speculates that the deified flesh of Christ in the resurrection, because it becomes eternal, it's outside of time and space, it can also function kind of back in the garden. I think that could work as a model for some of the Theophanies. For example, perhaps in Ezekiel 1 or Ezekiel 10, when you have one like the Son of Man appearing, who's described as the face of God, the glory of God. But there's other passages where we have references to theophanic presentations or manifestations that doesn't seem to work with. For example, in Leviticus 9, it talks about the glory of the Lord appearing to all of Israel. And it says the fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering. And I think if we look at the way Paul in Hebrews describes God, he says our God is a consuming fire. And I don't think there's any created fire. And in fact, if you read the debate that Palamas has with Barlium, the idea that there is a created element to the Theophanies he tends to argue against that. Again, you could perhaps have the opinion that Bishop Irenaeus has from St. Irenaeus, that maybe in some of these Theophanies, it's the physical resurrected flesh of Christ that's appearing even in the garden or something like that. But there's also situations where it doesn't seem to be the case. There's several Theophanies in Numbers. There's a couple places, again, in Leviticus, where it seems like the fire is called God, the cloud is called God. The cloud is referenced in the New Testament, for example, as a manifestation of the Holy Spirit. And the glory cloud that's over Mary is an energetic manifestation, like the dove and like the tongues of fire at Pentecost. And when, for example, the Icon Council, when it decided that you could only present the Holy Spirit in his energetic manifestation of dove or fire, it is not saying that the Holy Spirit is created fire. It's not saying the Holy Spirit is a dove or a bird. It's saying that it's a manifestation like that, right? Because we don't equate God to any created thing. These are sort of analogous terms that describe the energy. So even the word fire or the word light, we only know those things from the created light of Genesis 1 compared to the uncreated light of John 1, or the uncreated fire of God or the energy of God, the light of God. Those are all kind of synonymous things. It's just the divine energy and manifestation itself versus how it appears in time and space, which I don't think is created. Now, the problem there is oftentimes people say, well, but wait a minute, how can you have a form in time and space, right? And again, you could go with the Bishop Irenaeus example, Bishop Irenaeus, St. Irenaeus example, or we could just simply say that this is the way Palamas argues when Barliam brings it up, is that it's a situation where God transcends the logical antinomies, that there's not a limitation on what God can do in time and space, because it's really no different than the kenosis of Philippians 2, where the second person of the Godhead willfully limits himself in time and space. So I think that the toolkit that Orthodoxy has, we have these metaphysical distinctions that allow for the difference between nature, person, will, energy, and the created effect, but also the level of mode, right? And the mode in which God appears is different from the thing in itself. So the energies come to us through the mode of the persons that act, but energies are not proper to person. That would be the Monophysite position or the Apollinarian position that William Lane Craig has. Energies are proper to nature, and that's why God's nature is one, and thus there's one energy, as John Damascus says in chapter 1, but also later on in chapter 1, he says that there are many energies of God because there are many works of God. So I think everything that we've talked about so far in this discussion, I totally agree with. My only qualm would just be with the fact that when Augustine says that Jacob is wrestling with his sin, that is true. That's a spiritual interpretation of the passage, which is perfectly fine in our layered exegesis. But it's also the case that there is a real interacting that's going on. And for example, if we were to spiritualize that passage, we would have very other crucial passages, say in Judges 6, for example, where it says that when the angel of the Lord appeared, it says he stood next to Gideon and Yahweh turned his face to Gideon. So Yahweh has a face, right? In Ezekiel 1, Ezekiel 10, the Son of Man, one like the Son of God, one who is the glory of God, the appearance of God's glory, etc. All these descriptors are in some way the ability for God to be in time and space. It is a coming and a going, but there's nothing about that makes God a creature any more than the second person of the Godhead being born in a stable, right, in Palestine and not in China, right? He's willfully limiting some of his attributes and powers to condescend to us. And if you read St. Cyril or a lot of the Eastern Fathers, they oftentimes speak of the incarnation as this kenosis that is a powerful mystery. Now, I'm not just appealing to mystery to say it's irrational or something like that. I don't think that the Trinity or the incarnation or the energies are irrational. They're supra-rational, and that's why they are prior to any of the metaphysical systems that we might appeal to, whether it's Aristotelian metaphysics or whether it's paraconsistent logic or classical logic. All of those things are they're going to be limited in the way that they can describe or picture the mode in which God exists. So that's all I want to say. But there is, by the way, one last quote I'll say just to be really quick here. Sorry for rambling, but Palamos is helpful because he says that the only way that there could have been an appearing that the Israelites could have seen, and he says even their physical eyes were able to see the divine energies, the uncreated reality of God. And you can think about this in the Old Testament with the Leviticus 9 passage or the Transfiguration. It's essentially the same problem in either passage, in either chapter, right? Matthew 17 or Leviticus 9. How could you have created beings seeing the uncreated energy of God? Because we all agree that no one is seeing the divine essence, I guess, unless you're a Roman Catholic. And Professor Manzarides has a great book called Deification of Man, the Theology of Gregory Palamas. It's a very short 100-page book. I recommend it, as well as everybody should read the debate between Barlaam and Orthodox. It's only 100 pages as well, because all these topics come up there, including the Theophanies, including whether God's works are infinite. And he says, Palamas finds no difficulty in giving the appropriate answer. Man is incapable of experiencing uncreated light through his powers of perception. So by our natural power, you cannot see God, you cannot see the uncreated energies. However, man is capable through a deification that occurs so that he can perceive it, not just in the nous, but even with the physical eyes. And this is, I think, the explanation for some of these Old Testament theophanies. This light, Palamas says, has sometimes also been seen by the eye of the body, not with mere created sensory power, but they see it after having been transformed by the Holy Spirit. For in the age to be, this same body will endure forever, gazing upon the divine light, but it will have become spiritual, as St. Paul says. So even in the Old Testament, even when the patriarchs are seeing these manifestations, St. Maximus has a very similar situation where he says the only way that in the Old Testament Abraham could see the triad or see the Son was because he had a deified perception that allowed him to see it. So it's still by grace. We're not saying that it's by human nature or anything like that. The only way to see God is if God gives you the uncreated eyes and the uncreated grace to see God. So